everyone, and welcome to this video focusing on exam technique and just tips for the history exam. I just want to say firstly that this is all based on my experience, so if your teachers say anything different, trust your teachers over me. And I did the Unit Y 106 Early Tudors, so this is all for the OCR exam board. So starting with an exam overview, the exam is an hour and a half long or 90 minutes, and there are going to be 3 questions on the paper, but you only write 2 of them. Firstly, there'll be one 30 marker, and that's going to be a source question, and that is compulsory, so you have to write the answer for the 30 marker. Then there's going to be 2 20-mark essay questions, but you get to pick one of them, so you answer only one of the 20-mark questions. So all of this totals to 50 marks. So now moving on to timing, this is all based on what my teachers recommended to me. When you first get the paper, you read through all the questions, including the 20 markers, just so that they're sort of running in the back of your mind and you can decide which one you want to do as you write the source question. Then spend 5 or 10 minutes reading through the sources. There are going to be 4 sources and they can be quite difficult to read because obviously they're written in the 14 and 1500s. Then you want to spend 45 to 50 minutes answering the first source question. It's good to get the source question out of the way because it's the most marks and you have to spend the most time on it because of that. Then spend whatever time you have left, should be about 30 to 35 minutes, answering one of the 20 markers. You have to be really strict on yourself so that you don't run out of time for the 20 marker, because it's quite easy to spend a lot of time on the source question and then you realise, oh, there's only 15 minutes left and I haven't even started the 20 marker. So I recommend working out of your exams in the morning or afternoon and then writing on your paper the times you want to move on. So if it starts at 9, write 9:45, and then at 9:45 you know to move on to the 20 marker. Because it's better to have a fairly well written 30 marker and 20 marker than to have a really good 30 marker and not have a 20 marker written at all. Okay, so now moving on to the source question. You're always going to be given 4 sources and they should be from the time period, which can mean that the language is kind of difficult to understand, but I think it's good to just read it and get a general overview, then understanding it word for word. The question is always going to be, using these sources in their historical context, assess how far they support the view, da 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 da. So the only part of the question that changes is the statement that you have to evaluate using the sources. The source essay is always going to be on the topics of Edward VI or Mary I. So for the source essay, you can completely forget about Henry VII and Henry VIII. It's only about Edward and Mary. And this is going to be the 3 subtopics: stability of the monarchy, religious changes, and rebellion and unrest. You must analyse the provenance of every single source, and this is just evaluating where the source came from, so the author, the date, the purpose of the source, and the type of source, so if it's a speech or a passage from a book or a letter. All of these things affect whether the source is reliable or useful. And reliability and usefulness are 2 different things. A source can be reliable, but it can not be useful. So reliability is whether or not the source is trustworthy, but usefulness is whether or not the source is actually helpful to answering the question. And a good way to show the examiner that you really understand the reliability and usefulness of each source is to just throw in these words if they're relevant. So words like convincing, limited, valid, insightful, useful, and unreliable. And if you think there's bias in the source and you can't find a better way to say it, you can use the word bias, but only if you clearly say what the bias is. So don't just say the author is biased. Say the author has bias against Catholicism and this is shown by the fact that they said this or that. So now moving on to the structure of a source question. Firstly, you have your introduction, and in this you should state which sources support the view of the question and which oppose it, so you need to group your sources together. And you also have to make a judgment about which source you think is the best and most useful. I often will leave this blank and then fill it in at the end because I find that when you've only read the sources 5 minutes ago, you don't really know them well enough to make that judgment yet. So I leave space for it and write it in at the end when I've written a whole essay about them and I understand them more. Next is the main part of your essay, the 4 paragraphs, so a paragraph per source. You can either write them source by source, as in start with source A, then B, then C, then D, or you can write your paragraphs in order of how you group them together. So start with the sources that supported the view in the question, and then write about the sources that oppose the view of the question. It's completely up to you, both ways are fine. And then you end with your conclusion, which is basically just a more detailed introduction. You have to conclude and make a judgment about each source in relation to the question and compare them to each other. And then you have to explain in detail which source you think is the most useful and explain why. Now, I've scanned in a copy of my paper from my last mock exam and I got an A grade on it. So it's not perfect, but I think it's a good example just to show you the tips that I'm talking about. So my source question was, using these sources in their historical context, assess how far they support the view that the introduction of Protestantism in Edward VI's reign was difficult. So I highlighted my sources using two colours. One colour represented that it was difficult and one colour represented that it wasn't difficult. So that way you can look at your sources and visibly see whether or not they support the statement in the question. And then I also just wrote next to each source whether or not introducing Protestantism was difficult or easy, just so that I didn't have to reread the whole source to figure out whether or not it supports or opposes the statement. And this is a scan of my introduction. You can see it's very short because I just went straight to the point. I don't faff around with setting the scene. I go right to it and say sources A and C support the view, B and D don't. Overall, I like this source the best. Because that's all you really need. You don't need anything more than that for the introduction. And I went back at the end and wrote the sentence saying source B is the best source because I didn't know which source I was going to say was the best until I'd written the essay and analysed them all. So I highly recommend just leaving a couple lines so that you can go back and make your judgment once you understand the sources. Now this is a scan of my paragraph about source B from my mock. And I think just about the structure, you should always try to stick to the basic peel, so have your point, evidence, explanation, and link. But with history A level, you obviously need to be a lot more detailed and go more in depth than that. So in purple, I've highlighted every time I've talked about the provenance of a source, and I've used words like balanced, useful, correct, reliable, omission, and bias, so that the examiner can clearly see I'm aware of the provenance. Blue is where I've made a comparison to other sources. This is really important and there should be more of this in this paragraph. But basically, once you've written one or two paragraphs, you need to start comparing to the previous sources and basically pitting them against each other, saying this one is more reliable than that one, but this one's less useful than that one. In orange is all the historical context, as that's in the question. You have to use your own knowledge. So after every point you make, try and put some knowledge in that backs up the point. And finally, in green, I've put every time I've made a judgment. It's really important that you have a clear judgment at the end of every single paragraph. And all you have to do is say, therefore, this source supports or opposes the statement in the question. That's all you have to do to make a judgment. And this is a scan of my conclusion. So the conclusion is basically a detailed introduction, but you have to go into much more detail and comparison. So you want to talk about the similarities and differences with the sources and saying which ones are more reliable than others. And you also have to explain which source you think is the best and most useful and why. So you want to summarise the strengths and weaknesses of the sources and also say which ones are more or less useful and reliable. And finally, don't forget to actually answer the question. So in my mock it was about whether or not it was difficult for Edward to introduce Protestantism. So at the end of my conclusion I've just put a quick sentence saying therefore it was fairly difficult for Edward to introduce Protestantism, as you have to stay focused on the question throughout your essay. Okay, so now moving on to the essay questions. You have to choose one out of the two that you're given, and I recommend you pick this based on the one that you think you have the most knowledge about. So a good way to decide this is to really quickly jot down the key points for both questions to see which one you have a more solid plan for. The two essay questions are going to be about Henry VII or Henry VIII, but it could be anything from their reigns. You could get two Henry VII's questions, you could get 1/7 and 1/8, or you could get two Henry VIII questions. And it can literally be on anything, so like foreign policy, domestic policy, finances, Wolsey, like the Reformation, just like anything from their reign. And it's really important that you have a clear and focused line of argument throughout your essay. So say your question was assess the reasons for the Reformation. I would just pick a reason at the start of my essay and roll with it and say that's the main reason, even if halfway through I think, oh, actually that wasn't the main reason, because it's better to have a coherent and focused essay than to change your mind halfway through and rewrite it and just have a terrible essay. So basically the most important thing is to have a convincing line of argument, as there isn't a right or wrong answer to these essay questions. So now the structure of the 20 markers. Firstly, you have your introduction and you want to briefly explain all the different factors that you're going to be discussing and also explain your overall judgment, so make sure you're actually answering the question. The main section is going to be your paragraphs. This could be 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 if you can squeeze it in. And basically each paragraph you're going to be explaining a factor and comparing it to all the other factors. And also at the end of each paragraph, you've got to have your overall judgment and your link back to the question. And then finally, your conclusion, where you want to summarize everything that you've discussed and make sure that you compare everything to each other, and then make your overall judgment really answering the question. Now this is also a scan from my recent mock, and you can see that I made really brief notes about the questions to help me decide which one I thought I had the best plan for, so I went ahead and answered question 3 because I had more knowledge about question 3. This is a scan from one of my paragraphs in my 20 marker, and I've highlighted in orange all the historical context that I use, so you can see how my own knowledge is scattered throughout the essay. And also in green, I've highlighted my judgment at the end of the paragraph, so I'm really trying to make it clear to the examiner that I understand the question and I'm answering the question. And then in my conclusion, I really am just summarising everything I've already discussed in my essay and making it really clear what my final judgment is in regard to the question. So the key points: read through all the questions first, know your timing and be really strict on yourself. Always link back to the question at the end of every single paragraph. Explain your own judgment and don't sit on the fence. Decide what your judgment is and go with it.